Welcome to the Bicurian podcast, where we explore and embrace the seeming contradictions of life. What actually is Bicurian, you ask?
Well, you may not necessarily have a mental concept of Bicurian, partially maybe because it's a made-up word. You embody it. What's happening right now in terms of the divisions between us is a focus on that which is different.
And lack of understanding and empathy for people's beliefs is no longer an excuse.
And it is in the differences we carry in ourselves that we find the Bicurian moment.
When you really dig into something, you're going to see some depth to it. It's not just a race thing. It's not just a conservation thing.
It's letting go of the or to make room for the and. We embrace all of you. Welcome to the Bicurian.
Hi, I'm Aisla.
And I am Eric. And this week's show, we have a pretty unique treat. I remember a few years ago when the 2016 elections were going on, there was a media bias chart that showed up. And we were presented with a rare opportunity.
I'm very excited to be introducing our guest this week, Vanessa Otero, founder of Adfontis Media and creator of the Media Bias Chart.
Welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for being here.
So, a little bit of background. I remember finding that chart. It showed up on Facebook, got passed around. Much controversy happened.
On Facebook, there was controversy?
Yeah, exactly. But I really appreciated that. So maybe you can tell us about yourself and how that whole project came along.
Sure. So I'm a patent attorney. I'm actually still a full-time practicing patent attorney here in Colorado. And in 2016, during the election, I just started getting alarmed about the kind of news sources people were sharing. And fake news is one problem, but people would argue with each other on Facebook. I'm sure you're aware. But what they'd use to support their arguments were things of really questionable quality and extreme bias. And they'd wonder why they couldn't convince people on the other side. It was really shocking to me that people who were fairly intelligent, I thought, couldn't still distinguish between news that was good quality and news that was bad quality. So I came up with the idea of laying this out on a visual grid because people like to see things visually. The media landscape is a complex topic, and one of the things I do as a patent attorney is explain complex topics through pictures and descriptions. But the pictures are the things that really help people. So I actually just made it to generate a discussion with my friends to facilitate that on Facebook. And I shared it, and a few people shared it at first, and I thought that was a lot. But then it just kind of went viral and crazy. And so that was 2016, and here I am now. I've made a company out of it.
Wow, that's really awesome. So I saw that you had done, or were doing an Indiegogo to increase the sort of depth of how did that go? And what's your goals there?
Well, that went really great. In the immediate aftermath of that first media bias chart, people started asking me "Oh, this is excellent. Teachers would ask me, can I use this in my classrooms?" And people would ask me what my methodology was and my data, and they just assumed I had all of this. And I had done a lot of reading about all of these articles, but really it was just me rating them according to certain criteria that I had set out. And I felt like the responsible thing to do was to make sure this information was as accurate as I could make it. And I can only do so much by myself in that regard, because to really rate media is a big task. It's complex. Not very many people are doing it because there's a couple of things about it that are very hard, notwithstanding the volume of content that's out there. That's a big challenge. But yeah, I expanded the chart myself over a couple of years, but this crowdfunding campaign, the idea was to generate a really big data set and make an interactive, dynamic version of the chart, so it wouldn't just be static. So people could go to the site, find the sources that they wanted to find, and be able to click through it and see all the different articles that not only I had rated, but a team of people with different political views had rated. And so the crowdfunding campaign went really well. We raised over $30,000. It ended last week. And, we could really do a lot with that in terms of putting out the initial media bias chart interactive version that we plan, as well as getting a ton of data that people can really dig into to see why we rank sources like we do.
So yeah, and that's great. Actually, you mentioned your methodology. Maybe you can expand on what your original methodology is and how you're kind of approaching that now.
Yeah. So when I first looked at it, there are so many things we take in as humans when judging the quality and bias of something, especially, given the news. I mean, we're all biased ourselves. We have our own personal experiences that are unique from everybody else. But there are certain things that most of us look at as good indicators. And that stuff, some of that stuff is measurable. A lot of that stuff is measurable. It's the content of the actual the piece that you're looking at. It's the headlines, it's the graphics, it's the leads, it's the individual sentences. So initially I started, there's a lot of things that make news good, and there's a lot of things that make news bad. There's a lot of things that make things more biased than not. But I find that, relying on, whether a source has been around for a long time or whether it has a lot of journalists, those kind of things can give you some indication. But the better indication is actually looking at the content itself and rating it on like a rubric, like you would for an AP test or a bar exam.
Gotcha. That makes sense. So you shared a blog post that you had done that I thought was really quite clever and helpful, and you shared it with that knowledge. You're like, this is something that really is helpful. So I was wondering if you would be willing to talk a little bit about junk news and labeling news with nutritious values, because I thought that was a really intriguing approach.
Yeah, so the idea came to me thinking about the idea of a nutrition label for food. The nutrition labels didn't used to exist. Those are a fairly recent phenomenon within the last 30 to 40 years, and the standards have changed for that over time. When a lot of junk food, processed food, and fast food first came on the scene in the 50s and 60s, initially it seemed like a great idea, but then we realized that there are bad health effects from consuming too much bad stuff like fat and salt and sugar. But people didn't really understand that. And one of the ways to help people understand that was nutrition labels. And providing information to people does help. It does make a difference. People can still make bad choices and can still decide to consume a lot of unhealthy food, but at least they have an option. So that's kind of the same way with the information and news industry. We've had this explosion of information sources available to us in the last 5 years, 10 years, just because of the availability of internet and social media. And so not all of it is good quality. Some of it, a lot of it is junk food. And it's hard for people to tell what's in it. So that's what we're trying to do, is doing a content analysis, telling folks, look, we looked at this and there are certain things that we can measure and tell you that are in there. Like, this is the number of fact statements that are in here. These are the number of statements that are expressed as opinion. These are the number of things that are not necessarily verifiable. And so if people have that kind of information, I think they can make better choices about the news they consume. And my chart itself, if you don't have it in front of you, if you haven't seen it before, it's a two-dimensional, and the vertical axis is quality, and the left to right axis, the horizontal axis, is bias. And the good sources, are the best sources, best news are at the top. And then there's a lot of stuff that kind of flows down from there that's of lesser and lesser quality. So if you want to make comparisons to food, the stuff at the top is the stuff that you should mostly have in your diet, like lean meats and vegetables and whole grains. And then the stuff down a little bit lower than that, some of it's still fine, like white bread and pasta, but you want to kind of have that in moderation. In this analogy, that's like analysis. we consume a ton of opinion and analysis, especially in TV. So like CNN, MSNBC, and Fox are all just so much analysis all day long. And it's kind of like sitting there and eating French fries all day. It's not that great for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great analogy, and it makes sense. I think I feel like I've watched CNN especially move to even more analysis. I remember in 2016, it seems like their response to being called fake news all the time by the president has been to pretty much try to pick him apart all the time. And do you feel like things like CNN have decreased in their function over time and their usefulness?
Yeah, I think so. I'm fairly critical of CNN and the other TV networks, the network cable news, because their format is 24 hours of what they call news programming, but it's not necessarily news. I mean, if I actually have subcharts that rank the individual shows for MSNBC and CNN and Fox News. Those are on my site as well. They're really interesting because some of them, like, for example, early morning shows tend to be like more like your local news, but on a national level. Like, here are 12 stories of things that happen. It's like a fire here, a crime there, an international story, a political story, a bunch of different things. But then in the middle of the day, in the afternoon, especially going into prime time, most of it is just 4 stories. They're all with the political happenings of the day. It's like 3 things Trump did and the fire, or 3 things Trump did and a hurricane. Like, those are the stories every single hour. It's the same ones, but they'll have 10 guests, up to 10 guests on the show, come talk about it to death. And I think that's not healthy. I think that doesn't serve the population very well, because it tends to drive the impression. I mean, if the 3 stories are about the political happenings of the day, it tends to drive the impression that they're biased. They may be saying truthful things and not be actually fake news, but the extreme focus on analyzing and picking something apart, it tends to make people think that it's more biased. People think CNN has moved more left. Because of you could argue that because of the topic focus, but that's all 3 networks are focusing on the political stories of the day.
Yeah, no, and I agree. I think CNN does look a lot more left right now because they're constantly in a attack defense position against like Trump and the current leadership of the country. So in a lot of regards, whether they mean to or not, it does look that way. I completely agree. One other quick question I had: have you gotten any feedback from any media sources? Many of the media outlets contacted you and been like, "This is useful," or "We wish you wouldn't have done this," or?
Yeah. So I've gotten complaints from both of the bottom corners. So that's which is totally understandable. I find that like more reputable sources tend to not comment about their own criticism, which I think is helpful, because they're journalism organizations are kind of like public figures, or kind of public entities in themselves. So they kind of expect to be criticized. There have been, I have heard from some organizations, mostly from journalists, individual journalists, not necessarily as representatives of organizations, as you say, "Hey, will you come on our show or talk about our ranking or something for to boost their own credibility," or anything like that. But journalists seem to get and appreciate this, because I rank journalism at the top. It's the top of this news ecosystem. Journalists actually going out and finding the news on the ground is the most important part of informing the public. And so I have wire services like AP and Reuters, and organizations that have a lot of journalists like the New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times, up near the top as well. There are lots of other sources that have more writers than journalists. So there's analysis and takes of the news. A lot of our information ecosystem is that. And then, below that, there are people who are taking that analysis information, just making it really low quality and biased. But so journalists appreciate that. And many of them have said that it is useful.
We went to a conference a couple weeks ago and actually attended a class that was on media literacy. It was really, really good. And the gentleman who was teaching it recommended that people get 3 sources, or was it at least 2?
Yeah, he was saying to look for 3 sources for any news before you just assume that it's true. And he was responding to something. I mean, you kind of brought it up because fake news, before that became the phrase Trump uses all the time. That was actually something that was coming out around the election, because people were, they're literally like these shell corporation or even just a shell website with a news article on it being posted up as like, this is now a fact. And he was showing some new technology. There's
deep
fake, which you can now basically animate in somebody. And so somebody could do a voice behind of the actual look and feel of a person. He's saying anything and making it look like Obama could be saying anything or whoever.
Yeah.
And so, like that was all the thing. And he was bringing up that, vetting your news sources. But I think your chart actually
makes that more possible, as I was thinking.
Right. Yeah. The chart's kind of a key ingredient in getting 3 sources, because if you pick 3 sources down in, like you said, the bottom corners, you're not likely to, you're probably going to get some confirmation bias going on there, just a bit.
Well, and he was recommending you look for one that leans sort of not your direction. So if you tend to lean left, look for one that leans right. And then for one that is more news, like you were talking about, more unbiased. I don't think he was suggesting actually 3. I think he was you're the third anchor in that. So if you lean left, find a source that leans right, and then find a source that's technically as much news as possible.
Yeah, so that's
how you triangulate your
right. So your measurement of journalism, I think, comes in there too. Don't necessarily assume InfoWars was accurate.
Right. It's a great point, and comparison is actually the most useful tool to distinguish media bias, especially distinguishing for someone who's maybe new at figuring out the information landscape. And I say new because it's not necessarily a person that's young. That it certainly can be, but somebody that's just unfamiliar with vetting sources. You can rely on the media ecosystem as a whole, because the media ecosystem tends to do a good job of telling you the truth. So, people will say, I'll have a source that's ranked very high, like the New York Times or something, and then they'll make a mistake, which all organizations make mistakes. And then they'll say, oh, I can't trust anybody, But the reason that the New York Times or another reputable publication made a mistake is because it's a field. Journalism is a field where it's immediately peer reviewed by people whose job it is to write about it. So they will, it's looked at from all of the angles. So you want to find out where the mistake was. This is one reason why, we have tools against things like deep fakes and like that AI video with like President Obama saying a bunch of stuff. That was crazy, right?
That's the deep fake that we were referencing.
Yeah.
But that can be used in other ways, and it's coming, like the technology is free.
Yeah. So that, and another big concern was, Sinclair bought a lot of local news stations, and there was a script that ran across like 700 news stations, and that was disturbing to people. But what we should take hope in is the fact that the reason we knew about it is because a reporter went and did that work to compare all across the spectrum and show these videos. And so we became informed because we were able to find information from across the media spectrum. So when you look at multiple sources, that's our best defense, because the ecosystem as a whole does do a really good job. We are very lucky here in the United States to have freedom of the press, and we can rely on that.
That's a really good point.
Yeah, absolutely. So, on our show, we do encourage a lot of participation. This is already great because I think, a lot of our listeners may think about how they're consuming their media, including ours, but other sources from your chart. Do you have any other recommendations? I know she mentioned the blog post, and I saw some stuff in there, but maybe you can give us some more recommendations about just in general ways people can avoid just being in consume mode all the time and worrying about what they're consuming.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, pay attention to like how the news is making you feel. If it's making you feel, angry and sick all the time, you're likely consuming just so much analysis and opinion that it's not helpful anymore. And so I really encourage people to stay towards the top of the chart. I mean, if in this analogy, like I said, the stuff at the top, it gives you what you need. It gives you the information, and it can give you information from things all over the world. So reading your sources, reading those kind of sources, that's a self-selecting those news, going to those sites instead of passively having the information come to you. This is less of a problem now because Facebook just shares less news. It just surfaces less news content. But before, when it surfaced a ton of news content, it would make people angry. People would just be consuming highly opinionated news. So they'd just be fed, in this analogy, donuts and fries and Cheetos, on Facebook all day. And then it would make them angry and then make them upset. Twitter is still like that, especially if your Twitter feed, in your Twitter feed, you follow a lot of journalists. It's just news after news after news. It amplifies the echo chamber, and it's typically a lot of the hot take industrial complex. It's just a ton of analysis. So Twitter in this example is like candy. It's like little and satisfying, but if you have too much of it, it makes you sick.
That's great. Yeah. One of the things that you had in your blog post that I loved was the concept of civic exercise as an antidote. And I thought it was kind of brilliant. Would you be willing to share a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, what do we do about the problem of, too much bad food to consume? Well, one thing is diet. You can eat stuff that's better and not eat the stuff that's bad. But the other thing that you can do is exercise. And that actually has like proactive benefits for your health. So what would civic exercise look like? And that is an active form. It's doing something that actually makes a difference. So voting, that makes a difference. Volunteering, canvassing. It doesn't necessarily have to be in the political arena. Talking to a person with whom you disagree is another form of civic exercise. You're taking in, listening to somebody else's point of view. Mending bridges that may have been broken because of previous political disagreements. I know you talked about that in your last podcast episode. Those type of things actually make a difference. The human relationships make a difference. Those are the ways in which you can actually change people's minds. Like you can win hearts and minds by doing that. Nobody gets convinced by sharing, being called stupid or wrong on Facebook, or sharing something. Like if you're extremely right and you share some, you're trying to convince your extremely left friend by sharing your extremely right article, or vice versa, that just is ineffective. It doesn't help. But having conversation, sharing stories, sharing how you're impacted by a policy or an action or a law, or something that happened to your family, those things actually move people and win hearts and minds.
Yeah, I'm very happy to hear you say that. As you noted in the last podcast, and something that I've said a lot, and Isla has said a lot, I feel like most people could benefit from getting involved in some way. So many of the people we know just feel so helpless right now, and all they're doing is consuming this media that just basically makes us all feel kind of bad. It's like, when was the last time you actually went to a city council meeting? Just something, just see what your government actually looks like in person,
and get to know the folks that are doing the work. You made me think of a quote that went around a couple of years ago that I wanted to share, because I'm actually going to put it on Instagram next week. But peacemaking doesn't mean passivity. It is the act of interrupting injustice without mirroring injustice. And that's just like what you're saying, like being able to talk to people without battering them, but also that doesn't mean that you're simply, being battered either. You can stand forward for something and disrupt things without it necessarily being aggressive.
Yeah, and I liked what you talked about in your last episode related to that. Because I totally believe that. We're going to have analysts and article raters that are from different sides of the political spectrum, and they can have very strong views on a particular policy position that are opposite from somebody else's, and still be on our analyst team because as long as they have the ability to be reasonable and to hear someone else's point of view and to try to be effective in their forms of persuasion, that's really what we're looking for. It's really about being effective. That's why I advocate, looking at the perspective of someone else. I think a lot of people are afraid to look at the perspective of somebody else because they feel like it compromises their own personal values and morals and beliefs. I think sometimes people purposely avoid media from the other side because they feel like they'll be indoctrinated or influenced or something, and they'll be betraying their own values. Like if you're, especially on something that's like very personal, very visceral, things like, being, pro-life or pro-choice, people feel very strongly about that. And sometimes folks will say, if you're entertaining an argument from the other side, then you don't really believe in what you are advocating. But it's not about that. It's about being effective. You can't win over somebody else if your arguments are just the same arguments that convinced you. You have to think about arguments that would convince them, and those are different arguments.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, kind of wrapping up here, how can people get involved and support you? And what other kind of projects are you working on?
Well, so the next phase of the media bias chart, like I said, is going to be the interactive version. And so what the project looks like is we're going to rate several thousand articles across over 100 sources, mostly the ones that are currently on the chart now. And each article is going to be rated by multiple people who have differing political views. So people can, this is a kind of like a self-funded study. We're building this web technology as well, so that it is interactive. And those things take money. That's why we raised some on with the Indiegogo campaign. People can ongoingly support us at our site, which is adfontesmedia.com. We want the media bias chart to always be a free resource for consumers because people need to be able to go to it and see what kind of news they should be able to rely on. But in order for them to know that they can rely on it, we need the data to back it up. So that's what we're working towards. It's adfontesmedia.com, and everyone can follow along with our progress.
Excellent. Well, this was fascinating. I was really thrilled to have you on. I was really thrilled to hear you were coming on. And we'd love to have you back at some point. So we'll keep in touch and go over
Absolutely.
things as it comes up.
Yeah. Thank you so much for giving us your time tonight. We appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Welcome to the Bikerian Moment. So, you first.
So I'm going first. I had a Bikerian moment sometime in the beginning of the year around Kirsten Sinema. And I don't know if I quite fangirled, but kind of a little around her. And she was running for Senate in Arizona. And
Tell us about her.
Oh, yes. Oh, I love that you asked that question. It's like, me. Kirsten Sinema. So I want to read actually a quote. So she won her Senate seat in Arizona. It was Senator Jeff Flake's seat. And it hasn't been held by a Democratic candidate in 30 years. So that's kind of intense. And there was I pulled some articles. They talked about her, and they're so much better than I am about it. So Sinema is more than 2 decades younger than the median age in the Senate, which is 65. She's 42. But don't read her youth to mean that she's a novice. Cinema worked her way from being homeless as a child to becoming a social worker who eventually went on to earn both a law degree and a PhD. She's spent the last 5 years as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. She's known for being a centrist Democrat. And then this is a quote from her victory speech. She said, "Everyone recognizes that the government is broken. And really, we all know the solution. We, the citizens of this great country, must fix it. We must be an active part of the solution. We must be willing to put down our sticks, sharpened for battle. We must be willing to turn to our neighbors and pick our neighbors up instead."
Yeah, she sounds like she's right up our alley.
She's right up our alley. She wrote a book called Unite and Conquer, which she wrote after her first year in this Arizona State House of Representatives. Because when she first got elected, this is a story she told in the class. I took a class from her. This is how I first got introduced to who she is. And she said when she first got elected, she was like, "I was so righteous. Like I had all the right answers. I was totally ideologically pure. And I spent an entire year being incapable of getting anything done. Because it turns out if you aren't willing to meet people where they are, compromise, see their view, then you can't get anything done."
Right.
And so she had to swallow her pride. She had to go back to the State House the next year and find a way to build bridges with people that she had possibly, I mean, having met her and listened to her, I don't think she was gentle when she said her opinion. And that also takes, I think, a lot of bravery to be able to like go and just say, wow, I screwed up all these things. And then she started getting things done and she started being effective. And one of the reasons that when I asked her, like, why are you doing this? Why did you run for office? I, at that time, was a little more cynical about politicians. And she said, because you can help more people. She said, she said, basically, as a social worker, I'd be working with these refugees and these people who were homeless, and they couldn't get resources that they needed because the system itself was set up to disempower them and to not be effective. And so she said, I was drawn to this work because my experiences, because I wanted to help these people. And so I decided I needed to go. And obviously now she's gone all the way up to Senate.
Yeah.
So look at that. And the other thing I did want to say is that both Senator Flake and her opponent, McMalley, were so gracious. Like they posted tweets about, being excited for her. Like Senator Flake was like, "I'm really excited that Kirsten Sinema is taking my seat. I know she'll do a great job." McMalley's concession was, "This was a great race. Thank you for doing a good job. I know you'll do a good job for Arizona." And I was just really impressed to see that while obviously they were all on their own teams and wanting things the way they wanted them, their public expressions of concession and victory were very respectful. And I think that sets a tone I'm excited to see, even just in one place in our country.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I'm very excited about that. Glad we got to share that. My Bikerian moment for this week, I was actually thinking about this. We live in a world of e-commerce, and I don't know if everybody's been living under a rock, but it's the holidays. So it's easy, and I would guarantee probably every single ear listening to this right now has probably purchased something online. And I was thinking about it the other day, maybe make some time in the last few days if you need some gifts and stuff, go and check out some of your local stores in your area, in your neighborhood. These are shops that have survived the e-commerce warfare and been able to stay open. They probably have some interesting things that maybe you don't think about. Maybe it's just a good way to go and kind of experience the neighborhood you live in. I have 3 or 4 different little neighborhoods that I've been poking around in and found a store that's like, I got to go back here. And I think I'm going to really make a point to try to shop local if I can this year. Just something to think about, way to support the local community and actually enjoy your local community.
I think that's a great idea.
So, thanks for listening. If you have ideas, feedback, thoughts, please find us on social media. We are Bikerian on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Or you can give us a call at 720-507-7309, and you can email us at podcast@bikerian.com.
And if you like what we're doing, please tell your friends about us or share the episodes that you find most interesting. Thank you.